common term in current scholarship to describe Viking military and political power is that of hydrarchy. This is a term used for piracy in the modern age, describing maritime self-organization, but it can also be applied for medieval Northmen. Vikings were not only lords of the seas, but also very cunning river chieftains who knew how to take advantage of enemy weaknesses. And let's have a look how. At the end of the 8th century, southern England had to start building defences. In Ireland, raids had gotten worse with the attacks on Inishmurray and Roscommon, widespread raiding with unclear victory. This might have affected Francia as well. Alcuin mentions attacks on Aquitaine and the Royal Frankish Annals, no fewer than 200 ships raiding Frisia. Suspicious numbers indeed, but the point was that the Viking problem was escalating, all the more that they dared demand £100 of silver to leave. And Frisia was a buffer zone between Franks and Danes, so a complicated region. Overall, in the first decades of the 9th century, these attacks had a common recipe: growing flotillas using hit-and-run tactics, ambushes and unexpected attacks even on fortified targets. The raids had improved the social standing of a lot of people: wealth, economic prospects, marriage. The elites who financed expeditions made additional gains: a bigger share of the prize, funding more expeditions, growing their retinue, strength, status, and so on. But also a lot of rivalry, expected side effects. The politics of petty kingdoms might have actually gotten worse, although one of the reasons for raiding in the first place was to export some homemade conflicts. While some had great success, some would not come back at all. The dangers were, however, met with the highly militarized ideology of Valhall and heroic ideals. One milestone for the history of the attacks is the year 834. Scandinavia is in hundreds of ships, boatloads of warrior bands threatening the very existence of Western powers. The Great Heathen Army, as it is known from sources. What is most fascinating is the lack of a single polity coordinating all these campaigns. Nothing can be understood in terms of politics or ethnicity. Archaeological finds reveal that the armies were no longer just armies, but rather migrating communities, with women and children included. A social experiment, perhaps? These fleets were political entities of their own. And once the fleets start growing and spend more time beyond Scandinavia, the initial summer job, turns into something else. For many, a frame of mind, a lifestyle. People were drawn to the potential, not just economic, but of any kind. In 834, an army from Denmark attacks and burns Dorestad, a wealthy town close to the Dutch coast. Not an unprotected monastery like before, but a great economic center. They devastate the whole region and continue to do so after failed negotiations with the Franks. Utrecht and Antwerpen were next, according to the Annals of Saint Bertrand. Then they head into the Irish Sea and on the way overrun Francia on the Loire, for example, the monastery on the island of Noirmoutier. In Ireland, markets and settlements become targets too, with the fleets establishing bases on the rivers from which to raid in the countryside. Around 840, camps are founded at Dublin and southern England also comes under attack. The trigger for these relentless attacks was, however, to be found in Francia, where the sons of Louis the Pious, Charles the Bold, Lothar and Louis the German, are fighting for the control of the empire. Vikings essentially take full advantage of this chaotic situation since the state suffers from divided loyalties with factions of magnates and bishops at each other's throat. Vikings float on the Seine, Somme and Loire into the heartland of Europe. They fight forces of the imperial contenders, raid local settlements, and even get employed as mercenaries for whatever faction. In this sense, they are the ultimate profiteers, encouraging the mess and gaining wealth and captives. De gente fera normanica nos libera que nostra vasta Deus regna, you could hear in the chapel of Charles the Bold. God, liberate us from the wild Northmen who are devastating our lands. And you can spot the result in the graves. They are filled with Frankish coins, metalwork and jewels. After the resolution of dividing the Frankish Empire in 843, Vikings are not intimidated, on the contrary. What starts out as raiding develops into a more permanent presence, as a fleet overwinters in Francia on Noirmoutier for the first time, at the mouth of the Loire, setting up a trend for years to come. Vikings would set up bases on such islets, basically controlling the waterways. After increasing fleets and mobile armies, in 845 Paris is attacked by 120 ships that raid their way up the Seine, potentially led by the infamous Ragnar Lothbrok, who is paid off with no less than a staggering £7,000 in silver and gold. It seems to be a very lucrative business, with Vikings further exploiting the weaknesses of the empire. It is not until 862 that Charles the Bold, now sole emperor, manages to organize an effective defense in the form of fortified bridges, with small openings blocked by chains and barriers. The number of ships reported by the annals drops, so the Vikings turn to another target: England. England, which unlike the Frankish Empire, was made up of several kingdoms in open competition, with the most important including Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia and Northumbria. The Grey Heathen army would challenge these kingdoms, and not without help from the inside, like horses or food. Not everyone was thrilled by the expansion of Wessex, for example, and Scandinavians could very well serve as a bulwark against this expansion. The army would have included among its commanders the sons of Ragnar, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan and Ubba, but was essentially a gathering of multiple small units. Lið is the term you're going to find to describe them. We should imagine them as networks of loyalties and loose affiliations under the leadership of jarls, at least nominal leadership. But no kings, as it were. In 866, Jorvik, the former Eorwich, is captured, and 100 years it remains the hotspot of Viking occupation. Afterwards, they make an attempt in Mercia, but Wessex comes to its aid, and in 869, Vikings capture Edmund of East Anglia, kill him, and take control over the kingdom. Understanding the English defensive system and using the army roads and beacons themselves, they even invade Wessex with the help of a second fleet. After Wessex defeats them at Ashdown in 871, King Athelred dies and his brother Alfred is crowned, who pays off the Vikings pretty much out of despair. To get it straight, the Northmen basically devastate all English kingdoms except for Wessex, with an army without a political leader or strategy. Part of them, under Halfdan, start settling down in York, while others under Guthrum go back to war with Wessex until the unexpected English victory at Edington in 878, with both sides agreeing on a treaty splitting the English territories in two. Essentially, the East and North would become the Danelaw, under the legal codes of the Northmen. And fun fact, the word law is actually a borrowing from Old Norse. At the same time, in Francia, Charles the Bold dies, again leaving a breach for a part of the Viking army to raid Francia. Even the Frankish capital of Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, is occupied. Paris ends up under siege again between 885 and 886, and a monk called Abbo speaks of a fierce fighting for the bridges and the use of siege engines. Remember, less than a century earlier, there was just a bunch of pirates burning some monasteries off the coast of England. The evolution is formidable. The economic loss of the Frankish Empire for protection money cannot be understated. We're talking here about thousands of pounds of silver and gold, and not only gold, but also grain and horses and livestock. If there is one thing to account for Viking success, that is flexibility. The same forces are moving, dividing, coming back together, raiding and settling. The scale of the invasion is best known from written sources, but lately archaeological research has started to reveal information about the camps. In Ireland, for example, Waterford, Cork, Dublin, Carlingford and so on, essentially places with good water access. A very productive archaeological research took place at Repton in Derbyshire, mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The camp contains an enclosure integrating the church as a gateway, Viking burials and a deposit of bones built into the mausoleum. Coins and Viking weapons link them to the Great Heathen Army, and isotopic analysis shows they came from all over Scandinavia, the British Isles and the continent as well. There are also post holes with different offerings indicating a heathen occupation. In the 2000s, a camp was excavated at Torksey in Lincolnshire. Here people had a natural protection due to the marsh, and there is evidence for manufacturing, trade, fishing, suggesting a mobile community, not just an army. So the latest archaeological data paints a much more complex picture. Multiple origins, activities beyond military ones, the presence of women. An estimate of 30 to 50,000 Scandinavian immigrants in the 30 years after the establishment of the Danelaw, and that's quite a number for the Middle Ages. In other words, it seems that after the initial attacks, the movement of people increased in scale, with families actually part of the armies, not just passive companions. And again, these forces do not represent a certain polity or state. Viking as an occupation, piracy, emerges thus as a much more complex reality. It's an entire social universe, the longship society, if you may call it so. More egalitarian, mobile, split authority with the crew, a sense of community. a lifestyle often in defiance to norms at home, but sometimes linked and sponsored by political figures at home, similar to what was going on in the golden age of piracy. In this age in particular, so in the 17th century, the term hydrarchy became popular, pointing out the lack of organization of the pirate world, which for them meant a formidable advantage. Think of these armies as the Greek monster itself, the Hydra. You defeat a bunch of ships and in no time you're challenged by a new force. It's not to say there were no readers at all, but that the whole system rather functioned as a temporary contract with limited togetherness, enabling different groups to seek out their luck in the wild world using a combination of plundering and settling. This also meant a formidable level of interaction with the realms they discovered and a permanent exchange of ideas and identities. So yeah, to go Viking is to become a pirate, but is also much, much more than that. It is to expand your own world and your identity. If you enjoyed the story and have comments and questions of your own, write them in the comment section and consider subscribing to my history channel. You're going to find a lot of stuff about the religion of the Vikings in particular and more academic lectures as well. This was Irina. Thank you very much for listening. Until next time.